It was October 2nd, 1975. Darkness cloaked Imrali Island, home to one of Turkey's most notorious prisons. Inside, Billy Hayes, an American prisoner condemned to decades behind bars, decided tonight would be different. With nothing but a stolen knife and a small wooden boat awaiting, Billy braved freezing seas, armed guards, and his own crippling fear. This is the story of one man's desperate fight for freedom. Prepare yourself, because this escape will leave you speechless. Our story today is about this American man named Billy Hayes. The story of Billy Hayes begins in his teenage years. During that time, Billy tried smoking hashish for the first time in his life. From his first puff, he felt himself falling in love with hash and began smoking it regularly. This brings us to the year 1967. At that time, he was 20 years old and had a close friend named Patrick. Patrick was a writer, a dreamer, and had quite an imagination. Billy and Patrick shared the same inclinations and worldview, so they became very close friends. Billy, who was studying at the university at that time, decided to drop out of college in 1967 at the age of 20. He felt bored with studying and, according to him, wanted to break free in life and explore the world, so he left the university. During that period, he needed some money, so he got a job as an assistant at a local hospital. He worked as a simple assistant with a modest salary. Once, while walking through the hospital, he passed by a room where a person had a broken leg. At that time, the standard method for casting fractures was to bring a roll of bandages containing plaster powder, wet it with water, and place it over the patient's leg in layers. Then the cast would begin to harden and become rigid to hold the leg in place. When Billy saw this method, he thought at that moment that it was an easy technique that he could do himself. So this thing, casts and plaster, stuck in his mind. Shortly afterward, one of Billy's friends returned from Turkey. He had been on a trip to Istanbul and came back with small pieces of hash. At that time, Billy and all his friends were smoking hash. So when Billy tried the Turkish hash, he immediately noticed the difference. It was of much higher quality than what they had in America. Billy asked his friend where he got the hash and what had happened during his time in Turkey. His friend told him that hash was sold openly on the streets of Istanbul and that anyone could get it easily. So he bought some, put it in his bag like it was nothing, got on a plane, and came back to the United States. Back then, flying was very casual, like taking a bus or public transport. There were no thorough searches, and it was common for people to smuggle prohibited items onto planes with ease. That's why airplane hijackings used to happen. People could even smuggle weapons on board. So smuggling a bit of hash onto a plane was one of the easiest things to do. So after Billy learned this information and found out that this high-quality Turkish hash was readily available in Istanbul, he started thinking, why don't I do it myself? Why don't I go to Istanbul and get some hash? He connected this idea with the cast he had seen at the hospital. He put the two ideas together. The idea of getting hash from Istanbul and the idea of using a cast on his leg to smuggle the hash inside it. Billy says that his main goal wasn't to make money. His goal was the adventure itself. He wanted to do something new with his life, especially after dropping out of university. In 1969, when he was 22 years old, Billy took his first trip to Istanbul, Turkey. As soon as he stepped out of the airport, the first people he saw were taxi drivers. He spotted one who looked young and asked him about the Sultanahmet area, a well-known historic district in Istanbul. The taxi driver immediately figured out what Billy was really looking for and asked him, "Hashish." Taxi drivers usually know what tourists are after just by looking at them. And from Billy's looks and the way he spoke, the driver could tell he was American and that he'd come looking for hash. Billy answered, "Yes, hashish." So the driver told him, "Come on," and Billy got in the cab. The driver took Billy to his house. Billy hung out there. They served him tea and Turkish delight, and he even played with the driver's kids and got to know his wife and family. Later, The driver came back with some hash and let Billy try it. And from the very first puff, Billy knew this was exactly what he came for. Top quality stuff. Then the driver asked him how much he wanted. Billy said, "A kilo or two, if you've got it." The driver said, "All right," and went off, then came back with 2 kilos and told him, "That'll be $300. Of course, $300 back then wasn't a small amount. It would be equivalent to around $1,500 today. Still, it was an amazing deal, very cheap for 2 kilos of hash. So Billy happily paid the $300, took the 2 kilos with him, and headed to the hotel he had booked before. Billy had brought with him the materials he was going to use to make the cast on his leg. He had brought plaster bandages and all that stuff. So right away, he started working on it. The first thing he did was use adhesive tape to secure the bags of hash to his leg. He kept taping the bags over and over to make sure they were firmly attached. He had to be sure they wouldn't move. Then he moved on to the second step, which was covering his leg with a plaster cast. He took the plaster bandages, soaked them in water, and started wrapping them around his leg in layers. The idea was that once the plaster hardened, it would hold the bags of hash even more securely to his leg. Once Billy finished setting the cast, he spent the night at the hotel. The next morning, he checked the cast and found it had hardened nicely and was holding firm. With that, everything was ready for the return trip. Billy left the hotel and took a taxi to the airport, walking with a cast on his leg. He didn't even need to fake a limp. The cast was so heavy and bulky, and with everything hidden inside it, it made him limp whether he wanted to or not, and that actually helped him play the part very naturally. When Billy reached airport security, he handed over his passport and got ready to be searched in case they decided to check him. Sure enough, the officers took his bags and quickly rummaged through them. They looked inside briefly, then closed them up and handed them back, telling him he was free to go. Just like that, Billy passed through airport security and got on the plane. With 2 kilos of hash strapped to his leg, the plane landed at JFK Airport in New York. He got off the plane, and this is where the fear really kicked in. He knew that if he got caught with all that hash, he'd be facing serious prison time. Billy picked up his luggage from the baggage carousel and managed to pass through customs and security without any issues. He started walking toward the exit gate. So far, everything was going smoothly. But then came the problem he never saw coming. As he was walking, Billy started to realize that pieces of his cast were falling to the ground. It was as if the cast was crumbling, and with every step, he was leaving a trail behind him. The plaster pieces were breaking off and dropping onto the floor. The most likely reason was that the bags of hash hidden inside the cast had caused clumps, so the bandages and plaster hadn't set or bonded together properly. That's when Billy started to feel scared. He felt like any officer or security agent could notice something was off with his cast. So he tried to walk faster to get out of the airport. But the faster he walked, the more the cast crumbled and broke apart. That was the scariest moment for him during this whole adventure. But luckily, no one noticed, no one stopped him, and he managed to get out of the airport without any problems. His plan worked. He made it to the US with 2 kilos of hash, and in that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of confidence. He felt like the smartest person in the world because he had planned, executed, and succeeded. Right after returning from Turkey, Billy started selling the hash he brought back in small portions. The product was top-notch, highly sought after in the market. At first, he sold to his friends, then his friends told their acquaintances, and more customers started showing up. Everyone loved that hash, and he kept selling and selling until he ran out of stock in less than a week. And get this, he bought the 2 kilos of hash for $300 and sold them for $5,000. That's insane profit. If we adjust for today's money, that's closer to $30,000. But since Billy had been broke for so long, when he suddenly had all that cash, He blew through it in just a few months on parties, trips, and messing around. And when the money ran out, he said, "Okay, time for the second trip. The first one worked, so why not do it again?" In October of the same year, 1969, Billy returned to Istanbul once again. There he met up with his friend, the taxi driver. They greeted each other and went straight to the driver's house. Billy bought 2 kilos of hash from him again. At first, Billy considered buying more, but of course, the more he bought, the harder it would be to smuggle. So he decided to play it safe, not take any risks, and stick with just the 2 kilos. But this time, he wasn't planning to use the same method as before. The cast was a bit too suspicious, and the issue with the lumps would have come up again if he used the same trick. So Billy decided to try a new method. He taped the bags of hash around his stomach and chest, then wore a loose winter coat over them. Billy was skinny, so even after taping the hash around his body and putting on the coat, he still looked normal. Nothing about him suggested he was hiding anything under his clothes. Of course, he was a bit nervous, but he decided to go through with his plan anyway. He headed to the airport, and just like the last time, they took his bags, gave them a light inspection, and let him through. No one checked his clothes, and no one suspected he was smuggling hash on his body. Airport security back then was extremely lax. There were no scanners or X-ray machines, and no one really searched people's clothes or bodies. Billy boarded the plane and flew back to New York. Once again, he passed through security and customs without anyone checking his clothes. He sold the hash he brought, and this time, he even raised the price and made more money. For the next few months, he lived off the money he made. But after 6 months, the money ran out again. In April 1970, Billy took his third trip to Istanbul. Just like before, he smuggled 2 kilos of hash and managed to return to New York to sell it to his clients. By then, he had full confidence in this smuggling operation. It had become his main source of income and his way of life. Whenever he ran out of money, he'd simply go back to Istanbul, smuggle 2 kilos of hash, and sell them. But between his third and fourth trips to Istanbul, major events unfolded in the Middle East, specifically in September 1970. That particular month was later dubbed Black September by the Arabs, and it truly lived up to the name. Tragic events took place, especially in the Jordan and Palestine region. We won't dive into the details of those events, but what's relevant to our story is that during this time, armed groups hijacked several airplanes, flew them to the desert, and blew them up in front of cameras. Of course, the planes were empty, no passengers on board. But the point is, security across the Middle East, particularly around aviation, was extremely unstable during that period. With the rising number of hijackings and people smuggling weapons onto planes, airport security started tightening up. Billy knew that his next trip would come with greater risks. Sure, Turkey and Istanbul weren't directly involved in the events, but they were still part of the region, and there was a chance that airport security would be ramped up. Still, Billy was confident, overconfident, in fact. He'd done it 3 times already, so he was sure he could pull it off a 4th time. His arrogance blinded him, so he went ahead and did the same thing. He met up with his friend, the taxi driver, went to his house, picked up 2 kilos of hash, taped them to his body, put on loose clothes, and headed to the airport once again, ready to fly back. Of course, this time, Billy was going to try to be more careful, so when he entered the airport, the first thing he did was stand back and watch from a distance, observing the people going through security and customs, and seeing what procedures they were going through. Right away, he saw that everything looked normal. Security was checking travelers' bags quickly and letting them pass. No one was being body searched or having their clothes inspected, so Billy assumed everything was fine and that he could pass through like usual, just like everyone else. He went to customs, handed them his passport and bags. They stamped the passport and checked his luggage briefly. Just like the other travelers, They let him through and directed him toward the plane. Billy was happy. Everything was going smoothly as usual. But after they passed through security and inspection, they were put on a bus, the one meant to take them to the plane. Billy found it a bit odd, since normally they would board the plane directly through the passenger bridge, the one that connects the terminal straight to the plane. But this time, they had decided to transport them by bus. In any case, Billy didn't think too much of it. After all, getting to the plane by bus is something that happens sometimes. While they were on their way to the plane, an older woman sat down next to him and started talking to him about her life, her son, how she ended up here, and what brought her. Billy nodded and pretended to listen, even though he didn't really care about what she was saying. But as the bus got closer to the plane, that's when the shock hit, something Billy hadn't seen coming at all. Billy, when he glanced out the bus window, was surprised to see a number of soldiers and officers standing in front of the airplane stairs. It looked like they were planning to search the passengers before they boarded. Billy started to realize what was going on. The recent events in the region had clearly put the security forces on high alert, tightening their procedures. They didn't want any weapons or bombs making it onto the planes. This was the worst-case scenario for Billy, something he never expected. If the search had been at the airport gate, he could have seen it from a distance and backed off. But now the inspection was right at the airplane door, and he was already on the bus with the other passengers. It was too late to turn back. Sure enough, the bus stopped, and the passengers started getting off one by one. Billy sat frozen in his seat, unsure of what to do. The only solution that came to his mind was to somehow stay on the bus, maybe go back with it. The idea he came up with was to pretend he had lost his passport and get down on the floor as if he were searching for it under the seats. Meanwhile, the passengers had gotten off, and the officers had indeed started searching them, thoroughly checking their bags, bodies, and clothing. This was a disaster for Billy, so he stayed crouched under the seat, pretending to look for his passport. But just then, the annoying old lady who had been sitting next to him on the bus asked what he was doing. He told her he was looking for his passport. She pointed to his pocket and said, "Your passport is in your pocket." The edge of the passport was sticking out. Billy replied, "Thank you." For her, she helped him. But in fact, she had ruined the whole plan. To make things worse, there was a soldier standing at the front of the bus calling out, "Come on, move it." And because of that woman who blew his cover, Billy had no choice but to get up and leave the bus like everyone else. He couldn't stay hidden under the seats any longer. Of course, at that moment, Billy was extremely nervous. He knew he'd be exposed if they searched him, so he started scanning the area, trying to analyze his options. People were lined up in two queues, one on the right and one on the left. First, the officers would take their bags and search them. Then they'd search their clothes and bodies. Once the inspection was done, they'd return their bags and let them pass through to board the plane. Billy kept watching this unfold in front of him, thinking. His only chance was to try to pass through without having his body searched, to act like he'd already been checked and just walk through casually and get on the plane. Even he didn't fully believe the plan would work, but he had no other choice. So he started walking quietly, slipping past the line, trying to take advantage of moments when the officers were busy searching someone else. Step by step, moving slowly, he actually managed to get past the first officer, carrying his bag on his shoulder. Billy took something out of the bag and put it back in, pretending like he'd already been searched. Then he kept walking toward the plane stairs. And that was it. He'd gotten past all the officers, and they were all behind him now. When Billy lifted his foot to climb the airplane stairs, he thought he had pulled off his trick. But at that very moment, just before placing his foot on the first step, one of the officers came up behind him and grabbed him by the shoulder. The officer started talking to him in broken English, asking, "Where you go?" Billy was obviously nervous and pointed to another officer, saying, "That officer already searched me. The officer holding him looked him up and down suspiciously, then turned to the other officer Billy had pointed to and called out to him, asking, "Did you search this guy?" The colleague looked at them and replied, "No, I didn't search him." At that point, Billy felt the grip on his shoulder tighten. The officer was now even more suspicious and immediately told him, "Hands up." Billy raised his hands, feeling defeated. This was it. He was about to be exposed. The officer started searching his body and clothes from top to bottom. Strangely, as he frisked him, his hands passed over Billy's chest and stomach, right where the bags of hash were hidden. He should have felt them. But the officer kept going down and passed right over the stash without saying a word. In that moment, Billy felt a flicker of relief, even a bit of joy. Maybe his loose jacket really did its job, kept the officer from noticing anything, especially since the bags were all pretty small. The officer kept searching, then went back up and started frisking him again from the top. And then suddenly, he froze. He'd felt something under the jacket. The officer looked Billy in the eye, visibly tense, then stepped back quickly, drew his gun, and shouted to his fellow soldiers, "Bomba! Bomba!" meaning bomb. Instantly, all the soldiers around them pulled out their weapons and aimed at Billy. Billy just stood there, frozen, hands still in the air. In that moment, he feared the worst, that they might shoot him right then and there. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't want to give them any reason to open fire, especially with how on edge they all seemed. The officer slowly stepped forward and lifted Billy's jacket to reveal the bomb. But instead, he found only a bunch of small hash bags. He turned to his team and said, "Hashish! Hashish!" At that, everyone let out a breath of relief and lowered their weapons. Everyone except Billy, of course. He knew this was just the beginning of the nightmare. This was the moment that would change his life forever. The airport officers handed Billy over to the police, and the police took him to a prison in Istanbul called Bayrampaşa Prison. The first thing they did was shave his head completely. Then they put him into one of the prison wards. This prison was a different kind of place. The ward was made up of several cells, and the inmates managed things themselves inside the ward. The guards usually didn't enter the ward. Instead, they assigned one or more prisoners to oversee the cells and the rest of the inmates in that ward. So the prisoner who had been put in charge by the guards led Billy to his cell. He even had the cell keys. Just imagine, a prisoner with keys to the cells. We'll call this prisoner the responsible inmate. He took Billy into his cell, and the cell was freezing. Of course, October is a cold month, and there was no heating or any source of warmth. Worse still, the bed was just a metal frame. No mattress, no blanket. The entire cell was just stone and metal, and everything inside was cold. Billy asked the responsible inmate, "Is it possible to get a blanket?" The inmate told him, No, there's nothing. Just go to sleep." Communication was difficult too. Turks rarely spoke English, and when they did, it was broken English, so that alone was a barrier. But Billy noticed something. When the responsible inmate closed the cell door, he didn't lock it, even though he had the keys. Maybe the lock was broken, or maybe the inmate didn't feel like digging through the dozens of keys he had just to find the one for Billy's cell. Either way, he didn't lock the door. After the prison guard left, Billy heard a voice coming from the cell next to his. Someone was calling out to him, saying, Hey, can you hear me?" Billy moved closer to the cell door and tried to make out what his neighbor was saying, but the words weren't clear. He looked left and right, and when he saw that no one was in the hallway outside his cell, he reached out, opened his cell door, and headed to the neighboring cell, the one the man calling him was in. As he got closer, the man handed him a wooden stick with a metal hook at the end and said, Take it. Billy was confused. He didn't understand what was going on. Why did this guy have a stick like that inside his cell? And of course, like we mentioned, communication was tough. Almost no one there spoke English well. But Billy managed to understand that the man was telling him there were blankets in another cell at the end of the hallway, and he was giving him the stick so he could go and grab some for the both of them. Billy still couldn't fully process what was happening, but he needed a blanket. So he took the stick and headed toward the cell his neighbor had pointed to. Of course, the whole place was dark, and he could barely see in front of him. Billy reached the cell where the blankets were kept, but the door was locked. So through the bars, he stretched out the stick to pull the blankets toward him, and he quickly managed to grab 2 blankets and head back to his cell. Naturally, he gave 1 blanket to his neighbor, then quickly returned to his own cell, covered himself with his blanket, and threw himself onto the metal bed. He was so exhausted that as soon as he closed his eyes, he fell into a deep sleep. But during that time, the inmate in charge, the one the guards had assigned to manage the ward, seemed to be walking through the corridor. Maybe he liked playing the role of a guard, checking on the other prisoners. When he passed by Billy's cell and saw him sleeping and covered with a blanket, he got angry and stormed into the cell, shouting. Billy woke up startled and confused. The inmate in charge tried to snatch the blanket from him by force, but Billy resisted and held on tight. They started tugging at the blanket, each trying to pull it away from the other. Billy got furious, thinking to himself, why is he trying to take the blanket? It's just a blanket, and no one was even using it. While they were still struggling over it, Billy clenched his fist and punched the inmate right in the face. The guy started yelling at him, but he was speaking in Turkish, so Billy had no idea what he was saying. The inmate quickly ran out of the cell, and moments later, he came back with 2 prison guards. The guards grabbed Billy and dragged him out of the cell. In that moment, Billy felt terrified. He had no idea what they were going to do to him. They pulled him out of the ward and took him down to one of the prison's basements. He didn't even know where he was anymore. Inside the basement, there was a rope hanging from a pulley. The guards threw Billy to the ground, grabbed his legs, tied them to the rope, and pulled it tight until he was hanging upside down. That's when it hit Billy. This was clearly a punishment room, a disciplinary chamber. Then a 3rd guard showed up, a huge, heavy-set man. Later, Billy would find out his name was Hamid. Hamid was the head of the prison guards, and he carried a thick baton. He raised it and started beating Billy's legs. Billy screamed and begged, "No, please." But Hamid showed no mercy. He kept hitting and hitting and hitting, while Billy cried out in pain. Billy didn't know exactly how long he was beaten in that basement, but when they finally took him back to his cell, he couldn't walk at all. They had to drag him. Even in the days that followed, he could barely place his feet on the ground to walk. Billy was a 23-year-old man who had never been in prison before. Naturally, being in such a place was a shock. He had to quickly learn how to adapt and survive in this harsh new reality. He needed to know when to speak and when to stay silent, when to stand his ground, and when to stay calm. He had to understand the rules of this world. But the worst part was that he was in a foreign country. Communication was incredibly difficult. He could barely find anyone who understood him. Over the next few days, he learned from the prison administration that he would soon be put on trial. They gave him a chance to contact someone from the outside. Of course, back in 1970, international phone lines weren't available to the general public, so calling his family in America wasn't an option. His only choice was to write a letter. So he wrote to his father, explaining his situation and the crisis he was in. He felt deeply ashamed of the mess he had caused and didn't even know what to say or how to explain it. He knew the news would bring his family great pain. Sadness, shame, and hopelessness weighed heavily on him. But he had no other choice. He had no one else to turn to but them. In any case, even though his father was clearly angry and frustrated when he got the news, he traveled to Istanbul within a week of receiving the letter to see his son. He met Billy in prison with open arms. He even brought the American consul in Istanbul with him. Billy, though happy to see his father, also wished the ground would swallow him up from the embarrassment he felt. The three of them, father, son, and consul, sat together as Billy began to explain in detail what had happened. A few days after that meeting, Billy was sentenced to 4 years and 2 months in prison. The sentence was actually expected. In fact, it was considered light for someone caught trying to smuggle drugs. Fortunately, the lawyer hired by Billy's father argued successfully that the amount in his possession was too small to classify him as a drug smuggler. As a result, he was charged with possession of hash or illegal substances, not trafficking. And that, in itself, was a huge relief. If he'd been tried as a trafficker, the sentence would have been much harsher. So, 4 years and 2 months was a decent sentence under the circumstances. But still, we're talking about a 23-year-old young man. It's heartbreaking to think of him spending 4 years of his youth behind bars. Faced with that reality, Billy was left with 2 options. He could accept his fate and try to cope, or he could try to escape. Of course, Billy still had trouble communicating because of the language barrier. So, over the following months, he spent a lot of his time learning Turkish, picking up a word here, a word there, and little by little, he managed to learn the language and was eventually able to communicate better with the other inmates. During that time, many of the prisoners would talk about the idea of escaping. What are the possible ways out? Where could someone go? How can you avoid getting caught? There were all kinds of discussions going on around this topic. Some of the inmates even had maps of Istanbul, and they would constantly talk about the train line that connected Istanbul to Greece. There was this one specific spot where the train would cross into Greece, and the idea was that someone could jump off the train there and end up in Greece instead of staying in Turkey. So the prisoners would toss around these kinds of escape ideas using that train route. But of course, it was all just talk. Actually pulling it off was a whole different story. Escaping wasn't easy at all, especially since this prison was heavily guarded. This wasn't a regular prison. This was where they put the worst of the worst. Killers, rapists, drug traffickers, so the security was extremely tight. What made things even worse was that there were constant problems inside the prison itself. Fights, conflicts, and violence between inmates were a regular thing. And sometimes, things would escalate into bloody confrontations. Some prisoners had knives or sharp tools and would ambush their enemies and stab them. There was also this strange, well-known thing in Turkish prisons, stabbing someone in the buttocks. It wasn't meant to be a deadly stab, so it wouldn't escalate the situation too much, but it was still physically and psychologically painful. It was a form of humiliation, a way to insult the enemy. Days and months passed, and a year and a half went by with Billy still in prison. During all that time, the idea of escaping never left his mind. He was always thinking about how he could pull it off. During that period, Billy learned about a place called Bekirköy Psychiatric Hospital, which was like a mix between a prison and a mental health institution, where they sent criminals with psychological disorders. According to Turkish law, if you're diagnosed as both mentally ill and a criminal, they send you there. Billy had heard from his fellow inmates that escaping from the psychiatric facility was easier. The security wasn't as tight as the regular prison. That's when Billy started crafting his plan. He would try to convince them that he was mentally ill so they'd transfer him to the psychiatric hospital. There, he believed escaping would be much easier. But breaking out of the facility wasn't the hardest part. The real challenge was what came after. How would he get out of Turkey? That's where Billy's close friend Patrick, whom we mentioned earlier, came in. Patrick would occasionally travel to Istanbul to visit Billy in prison. During one of those visits, Billy told Patrick about his plan to escape through the psychiatric hospital. He felt free to talk because, even though the guards were standing nearby, he knew they didn't understand English, so he spoke openly. He explained that he would try to convince the administration that he was mentally unstable so they'd move him to the psychiatric hospital, where escape would be easier. Patrick supported the idea and told Billy he'd help. The two friends agreed that once Billy escaped, Patrick would be waiting for him in a car, and then they would head from Turkey to Greece. But for the plan to succeed, they needed documents and IDs that would help them cross the border. So they divided the tasks. Patrick's job was to somehow get fake IDs, while Billy's task was to convince the prison administration that he was mentally ill. Billy thought his mission was super easy. Over the next few days, he started acting completely insane, doing weird things, screaming out of nowhere at the guards and other inmates, and saying random, incoherent stuff. Eventually, he was brought before a panel of 3 psychiatrists for evaluation. Billy kept up the act and delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar. He played the role of a madman like a pro. For example, if one of the doctors started writing something down, Billy would freak out, yelling, "Why is he writing? Why?" Then suddenly he'd jump up and start bouncing around the room. Of course, he had to be careful not to overdo it, so they wouldn't catch on that he was faking. And apparently, he nailed the balance perfectly. In the end, they were convinced he wasn't sane and decided to transfer him to a psychiatric prison under observation. It wasn't a permanent transfer, just a temporary one for them to monitor his behavior and confirm his mental state. The important thing is, Billy got exactly what he wanted. He made it into the psychiatric prison. Now he just had to wait for his friend Patrick to prepare the fake documents and IDs so they could kick off the escape plan. But the moment Billy stepped into the psychiatric prison, he realized this place was madness in every sense of the word. He'd been so focused on escaping, he never stopped to think what the inside of a psychiatric prison would actually be like. And this place, it lived up to its name. The inmates were in a terrifying state, completely gone. Some were screaming, others were just wandering aimlessly. Some stood there staring at the ceiling, totally disconnected from reality. But what made it worse was that these people weren't just mentally ill, they were also criminals. Murderers, rapists, seriously dangerous individuals. These inmates were a mix of madness and crime, and that's what made them truly dangerous. It was a cocktail no one in their right mind would want to be around. One of the inmates kept following Billy everywhere, pointing at him and repeating, "Cigarette, cigarette," trying to get one from him. This guy was glued to Billy 24/7, constantly pestering him to the point Billy lost his patience. Another inmate pretended to be a judge. He'd act like he was in a courtroom, putting other inmates on trial, and they'd go along with it. They'd stand before him and pretend to cry when he sentenced them. They were all living in their own little performance. A different group would just circle around a pillar in the middle of the room, walking around it with no purpose at all. Every corner of this place had someone more deranged than the last. At that moment, Billy started doubting his entire plan. He wasn't even sure he could survive in a place like this. It was by far the craziest place he'd ever seen in his life. But at least there was one silver lining. The escape would definitely be easier from here than anywhere else. When Billy first saw the walls of that prison, or rather, the hospital, he noticed that they were low, with cracks and uneven edges at the top. It wouldn't be hard at all to climb over them when the right opportunity came along. Even the security wasn't that tight, and there weren't many guards, since the place was primarily a hospital before it was ever turned into a prison. So now, all he had to do was wait for his friend Patrick to complete his mission. As we mentioned, Patrick's mission was to get Billy a fake ID and forged documents so he could cross the border. Patrick had managed to bring a decent amount of money with him from the US. The money was meant to be used to obtain those fake documents for his friend. Of course, to get that done, Patrick had to reach out to people with experience in that field. In other words, people from the criminal world. Time passed. Then one day, Billy received a letter in prison. It was from his father, but inside was a devastating shock. His father wrote that Patrick had been found dead in his hotel room in Istanbul. He had a knife stabbed into his chest. In order to get Billy the forged documents, Patrick had to deal with criminals. These criminals found out he had money, and instead of fulfilling his request in exchange for cash, They decided to kill him and take the money. Billy was struck with immense shock. He felt like it was all his fault. If he hadn't tried to smuggle hash, if he hadn't ended up in prison, if he hadn't planned to escape, if he hadn't asked Patrick for help, his friend wouldn't have died like that. The guilt was overwhelming. Those were the thoughts running through Billy's head at the time, and he felt like the moment he got that news was the worst moment of his life, even worse than being arrested, worse than anything he had experienced in prison. He felt responsible for the death of his closest friend. Dark thoughts began to consume Billy. His family was suffering because of him. His friend had literally died because of him. And now he was stuck in a madhouse surrounded by lunatics with no purpose. At that moment, he genuinely wished he could become one of them. He could lose his mind and go crazy just to forget everything he was going through. So he started circling around the pillar like the other inmates, acting mad like them. At that point, he truly felt like his spirit had been broken, and any idea of escaping prison completely left his mind. About a month later, his observation period in the mental hospital ended. After another evaluation by the psychiatrists, this time he didn't pretend to be crazy. He was calm and spoke to them with full mental clarity. The result? He wasn't insane. So they decided to transfer him back to the original prison. And that's exactly what happened. He went back to the old prison and made up his mind to serve out the rest of his sentence quietly and with full acceptance. He had less than 2 years left. He decided he'd finish them in prison and get out. Billy wasn't ready to let anyone else suffer because of him ever again. It was enough that his friend had died, and that he had already brought so much pain to his family. The days passed slowly in prison, but they did pass. Day after day, week after week, month after month, and Billy counted each one. He had a calendar, and every day he crossed out a date until he was almost at the end. Only 54 days left, about 2 months. That day, the American consul in Istanbul came to visit him in prison. At first, Billy was excited. He told himself maybe they were going to release him early. But as soon as he walked into the visitation room and saw the consul's face, he immediately knew something was wrong. The consul looked grim, not a trace of happiness on his face. That expression instantly made Billy uneasy. The consul was definitely bringing bad news, and Billy's mind immediately went to his family. Maybe someone had gotten hurt, or had an accident, or worse, died. Billy sat down with the consul, and the shock hit hard. The consul told him that the Turkish Supreme Court had changed his sentence. Billy felt the world spin around him. He asked, "What do you mean they changed it?" The consul explained that initially, the court in Istanbul had sentenced him for possession of hash. But now, the Supreme Court had changed the charge to drug smuggling. They had tried to convince them to reconsider, but it was clear they had no intention of going back on their decision. The new sentence would be no less than 30 years, and could even be life in prison. Billy was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could his sentence suddenly turn into life in prison? Just moments ago, he was counting down to his release in 2 months, and now this. He couldn't wrap his head around it. In the end, the consul apologized and told him that neither he nor the lawyer could change the decision. Billy returned to his cell, not even knowing what to feel. The level of despair and rage he felt was overwhelming. His hands trembled, and he cried. He felt like he was going to explode from the pain. And right then, the thought of escape came back to him. There was no other option. There was no way he could spend the rest of his life there without fighting back. Some time later, the official ruling came from the Supreme Court. 30 years, just like the consul said. They gave him the minimum sentence, but to Billy, 30 years or life was the same. It made no difference. Along with the ruling came an order to transfer him to another prison. Indeed, Billy was sent to a place called Imrali, which was also the name of the island it was on. A small, isolated island with nothing but that prison. The whole island was basically a prison, like Alcatraz, Although Imrali was considered a high-security prison, it actually didn't have tall walls or extreme security measures. The sea that surrounded the island was the wall, the barrier that stopped anyone from even thinking about escape. If a prisoner tried to swim across, it was basically a death sentence. The vast sea was impossible to cross by swimming. The sea itself was the most powerful security measure. Imagine, in this prison, inmates were actually allowed to walk around the island. It was a semi-open prison. Of course, there were guards, procedures, and cell blocks, but the place was more like a labor camp than a detention facility. It felt more like a small town or a work camp where prisoners carried out jobs. At the center of the island, there was a canning factory where the inmates worked. Billy, when he arrived at this prison, was actually happy they transferred him there. Just the freedom of movement they gave the prisoners was a major upgrade. At the time, he thought that even if the island was surrounded by the sea on all sides, as long as there was some freedom to move around, he'd eventually find a way to escape, sooner or later. This prison, as we mentioned, was a labor camp. Boats would arrive at the island loaded with all kinds of agricultural goods, vegetables, fruits, and the prisoners were the ones who unloaded them and carried them to the factory located in the center of the island. Inside the factory, their job was to can the produce. That was the main work assigned to the inmates. Billy noticed that the boats carrying the produce also had small wooden dinghies attached to them. These wooden boats were packed with produce when they arrived, but they returned empty. Billy spent a long time observing these boats, how the produce was unloaded, and every little detail, because in his mind, the boats were his only real shot at escaping. So he focused all his attention on them. He noticed that as soon as the boats docked and the unloading was done, they immediately left. They never stayed on the island. On top of that, during the unloading process, the security was tight. Guards closely monitored both the inmates and the process itself, meaning there was no chance to sneak aboard during unloading. Over time, Billy began to lose hope in the boat plan. He couldn't find any loophole that would allow him to get on one. But on one particular day, October 2nd, 1975, Billy noticed a storm was approaching. The clouds were gathering in the sky, the sea was getting rough, and the wind was picking up. That evening, he noticed something different. The boats stayed put even after unloading their goods. He even saw the boatmen dropping anchor to secure them in place. And of course, that made sense. If there's a storm at sea, the boats would logically remain docked on the island. Billy's eyes were fixed on the small wooden dinghies tied to the larger boats, now empty after unloading. And once the idea sparked in his mind, he couldn't shake it. He knew he had to try escaping that night, because who knows when he'd get another chance. That night really was going to be Billy's escape night. October 2nd, 1975. Like we said before, this island prison didn't have high walls. It was made up of a bunch of old buildings, kind of like castles, that had been repurposed into a prison. They built some watchtowers around the island and converted some of the buildings into barracks and guard rooms. One of the buildings was turned into a canning factory, where they placed canning machines and other equipment. Some buildings were turned into inmate dorms, large rooms that each held 30 to 40 prisoners, more like a housing complex than a typical prison. Every night, there was a prisoner roll call. They'd call out the names to make sure everyone was present. After that, lockdown started, meaning no prisoners were allowed to walk around, and they were expected to go to their beds and sleep until the next morning. But that night, after the guards finished the evening count, Billy lay in bed for a while, turning from side to side. Once he was sure the guards had left and things had quieted down, he got out of bed. But before moving, he reached under his mattress and pulled out a piece of cloth. Inside that cloth was a small knife he had stolen from the factory some time earlier. He'd wrapped it in the cloth and hidden it under his bed. He got down from the bed, took the knife, and slipped out through one of the room's windows. The windows and doors weren't really locked. As previously mentioned, the place felt more like a camp than a proper prison. Once outside the window, he already knew the route he was going to take. First, he headed toward the big garbage bins near the factory, where they used to throw away fruit and vegetable peels after the canning process. Billy hid next to those bins for a while to observe the area. The guards did nighttime patrols, but they weren't very frequent. There were also guards in the watchtowers, and they had big spotlights that they would shine on different areas. Billy had memorized their routine and knew exactly where they usually pointed the lights, so he was confident he could avoid them easily. The most important thing was not to accidentally run into a guard along the way. Billy fixed his eyes on the dock where the boats were moored and started getting ready to move toward it. He checked everything around him and made sure the path was clear, then headed straight out. He kept walking slowly and cautiously until he reached the rocks leading to the shore. There was a rocky ledge that led down to the coastline. From there, he started crawling across the sand toward the sea. This was the most exposed spot in his entire plan. If one of the guards happened to shine a light on him, they'd spot him instantly. So he tried crawling as fast as he could to reach the water. He finally made it, but the water was freezing. He'd expected that, of course, but it still shocked him. He began swimming toward the dock and the boats tied up there, keeping his eyes locked on one specific boat, the one closest to him. When he finally reached it, he grabbed on and pulled himself aboard, collapsing on the deck as he tried to catch his breath. His body was shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the fear. His adrenaline was through the roof though, which helped him recover quickly. He got to his feet and pulled out the small knife he had, using it to cut the rope tying the small wooden boat to the larger one. But just as he was cutting the rope, he suddenly heard a window above him open from the larger boat. He immediately ducked down, curled up as tightly as he could, and hid in the small boat. Above him, someone stuck their head out of the window. It was the owner of the boat, literally right above him. If the man had just looked down, he would have seen Billy instantly. Billy froze in place, trying not to make the slightest move so he wouldn't draw any attention. The man suddenly spat into the sea, then after a moment, went back inside. Billy heard the window shut. He waited there for a bit, maybe a minute or two, and once he was sure the coast was clear, he got back to work. He took out the knife again and kept sawing at the rope until it finally snapped. Instantly, the small boat drifted away from the larger one, carried by the waves. Billy grabbed the oars and started rowing, moving farther and farther away from the island. All his focus was on rowing. He rowed and rowed and rowed until it suddenly hit him. He was completely away from the island. And in that moment, despite how exhausted and drained he was, Billy was overwhelmed with joy. For the first time in 5 years, he truly felt free. But that feeling didn't last long. Billy quickly realized he was lost, floating in the middle of a vast sea, with no idea which direction to go. From the maps he'd seen back in the old prison, Billy knew that Imrali Island Prison was located right here. The closest shore was in a province called Bursa. He didn't have an exact sense of direction, but based on the maps, he tried to estimate where south was. That was the direction that would lead him to the coast. He was going purely off instinct. Even though he was exhausted and worn out, the adrenaline pumping through him gave him the strength to keep rowing. He kept telling himself he would row until he either reached the shore or died. There was no third option. Billy kept rowing and rowing across that vast sea, and finally, at dawn, he started to see the coastline from a distance. That gave him an extra push, and he began rowing even harder until he finally reached the shore. In that moment, Billy felt victorious. Just escaping from prison and making it all this way on his own was a huge accomplishment in itself. As he walked on the sand, Billy felt true freedom for the first time in 5 years. But he knew he had to keep moving if he wanted to hold on to that freedom. The prison guards would definitely have discovered his escape by now, because there's a morning head count for the inmates, so he had to get as far away as possible before word spread and the search for him began. Billy was now on the coast of Bursa, exactly what he expected, since it's the closest coastline to the prison. Just to be sure, he asked the local people, and they confirmed he was indeed in Bursa province. Luckily, Billy spoke Turkish. Billy took a taxi from the coast to central Bursa, and from there, he caught a public bus heading to Istanbul. Once in Istanbul, he went to a hotel owned by the Hilton Company. Why that specific hotel? Because he had a friend from his previous prison, before the island prison, who had gotten out and was now working there. This friend, by the way, was Afghan, not Turkish. Billy had told him he was planning to escape before being transferred to the island prison, and the friend had offered to help if he succeeded. So Billy came to that hotel hoping his friend could hide him for a few weeks while he figured out his next move. But when Billy arrived and asked about his friend, the hotel staff told him the guy had returned to Afghanistan a while ago. At that moment, Billy felt lost. He had pinned all his hopes on that friend sheltering him, and now that hope was gone. He needed a new plan. Billy was also exhausted, completely drained, so he decided to rent a room at the hotel and get some rest. When he woke up, Billy asked the hotel staff for some maps. He started studying them, trying to figure out a route. His goal was to reach Greece, the closest country to Turkey, especially from Istanbul. Plus, the two countries have a hostile relationship, so if he managed to get to Greece, even if caught, Greece would likely not extradite him back to Turkey. His plan was this: leave Istanbul and head toward a province called Edirne, which is right on the border with Greece. On that border runs a long river called the Maritsa River, which actually serves as the natural boundary between the two countries. If you're on one side, you're in Turkey, cross the river to the other side, and you're in Greece. Billy's goal was to reach that river and cross over to the other side. Billy had indeed reached an area near the river, an open space close to the border. Of course, there were Turkish soldiers monitoring the border, but the number of soldiers wasn't high. After all, this is a long, sprawling border, and there are places where it's hard to install fences, nets, or walls. So there are still open areas under surveillance, but it's difficult to heavily guard them because the border stretches for miles and miles. It would take thousands of soldiers to cover it all. Billy kept watching from a distance, observing the soldiers' movements in that area. There weren't many of them. Just one or two would pass by every now and then. When he saw that the area ahead of him had cleared, he began to move forward. He was in slightly low ground, while the soldiers were walking along a hill or slightly higher ground. So he kept his back low and crept forward little by little. Whenever he saw a soldier getting close to where he was, he'd hide behind a small bush or patch of plants. He kept moving forward like that until the ground dipped even more, like he was going down into a ditch. He almost reached the edge that would lead him back up. Just as he started to climb, about to emerge onto higher ground, he heard footsteps. He immediately froze, lowered his head, and crouched down. Two border guards were walking literally right above him. He hadn't noticed them earlier because he was moving through very low ground, basically like a trench, while they were walking on the path directly above. Just imagine. If he hadn't noticed them at the last second and ducked down to hide, they would have caught him for sure. Billy curled up and froze in place like a rock, silently praying that they wouldn't see him, just like what happened to him on the boat. Luckily, the soldiers kept walking and passed by without noticing. After Billy made sure the soldiers were gone and the path was clear, he climbed out of the trench he was hiding in and quickly began walking toward the other side. There were trees over there, and he kept going deeper and deeper among them. After a little while, he began to hear the sound of water. It was the river. He immediately followed the sound. After walking a bit more, he saw the river ahead, not far off, so he kept going straight toward it. As soon as he reached the riverbank, he threw himself into the water and began swimming to the other side. At that moment, he was terrified the soldiers might spot him, maybe even open fire, but there was no turning back now. It was either freedom or death. Billy kept swimming and swimming until he reached the opposite bank. He got up and began venturing into this new land. He assumed he had made it to Greece. According to the maps and knowledge he had, the other side of the river should be Greek territory. But in truth, he had never been here before, and he didn't really know the place, so he was still afraid he might somehow still be in Turkey. And even if he had reached the Greek side, there were definitely border guards here too, and he had no idea how they'd react if they saw him. So he kept walking cautiously. He wandered through forests and trees, unsure which direction to take. His head was spinning from confusion and exhaustion. While walking, he didn't notice the small hut beside him. It was actually a military outpost for the border guards. One of the soldiers saw him and was startled. He immediately came out of the hut, pointed his weapon at Billy, and started yelling. Billy instantly raised his hands, but the soldier kept shouting at him. It was clear he was asking something like, "Who are you?" or something similar. That's when Billy realized he didn't understand a word the soldier was saying. And since he could speak Turkish, he knew this was a different language. He concluded he had finally made it to Greece. At that moment, Billy smiled and burst into laughter with his hands still raised. He even dropped to his knees out of pure joy. More soldiers gathered around him while he stayed on the ground laughing, and they looked at him in confusion. Billy knew then that he had gained his freedom, but even the Greeks weren't particularly kind. They held him for about 2 weeks and kept interrogating him during that time to if he had any military intelligence about Turkey or anything like that. As we mentioned, there's a long-standing enmity and various disputes between Turkey and Greece. But after the questioning was over, and they were sure he didn't know anything, they coordinated with the American authorities and sent him to Frankfurt, Germany. There, the U.S. authorities questioned him again, and after a few days, they allowed him to return to the U.S. on October 24, 1975. When Billy first arrived in New York, there was a huge crowd waiting for him at the airport. His story had gone viral ever since he escaped from prison, and a lot of media outlets and journalists were eager to cover it. Of course, front and center among those waiting were his family and his father, who embraced him the moment he saw him. Cameras and reporters were everywhere, and the photos you see here are real images from those moments at the airport. The story kept gaining more and more traction in the American media. Literally, there wasn't a single outlet that didn't cover it. Within just a few days of his return, Billy began appearing in interviews and television shows, sharing his story more and more. People, his friends, family, and those close to him, thought he'd come back traumatized and would need time to recover from the shock he'd been through. But it was quite the opposite. Billy started doing interviews and opening up about everything. He became very public and transparent. At the time, this might have been the most famous story in America. Billy quickly took advantage of the attention and announced, during his very first TV interviews, that he was going to write a book telling his full story. And within less than 2 years, the book Midnight Express was published in 1977. Just 1 year later, in 1978, a movie of the same name, Midnight Express, was released. That film caused a huge stir, as the story was at its peak popularity, and everyone was excited to see it. But the film told the story in a very distorted way. They changed a lot of the details. Even the prison escape was completely rewritten. They didn't mention the island prison or show that he escaped by boat. Instead, the movie depicted him accidentally killing a guard, stealing his clothes, disguising himself, and walking out of prison. An entirely different version of events. The only thing the movie got right was how it all began. Billy trying to smuggle hash, getting caught at the airport, and being imprisoned in Istanbul. After that, everything about the prison experience was heavily altered. The film also portrayed Turkey in a very negative light. Every Turkish character, whether a guard, judge, lawyer, or prisoner, was shown in a bad way. So when the film became a hit in the US, it actually caused a serious diplomatic crisis between Turkey and America. Billy himself wasn't okay with the way the film was made. He said that during his story, he met many kind Turkish people who treated him well, but the director completely ignored that side and portrayed Turkey and the Turkish people as extremely evil. Believe it or not, the film had such a strong impact that it seriously hurt tourism in Turkey, and that tension lasted for years. We won't go too deep into the details, but even Billy, over the following years, appeared in several interviews and apologized for the image the film portrayed of Turkey and its people. He said he respected the country and its people and kept repeating that apology over and over throughout the years. In 2007, 30 years after the film's release, Billy received an invitation from the Turkish police to come to Istanbul. Some of his close friends and even his lawyer advised him not to go, warning that he might get arrested if he returned. But Billy, wanting to show how truly sorry he was, went ahead and traveled to Istanbul. This time, the news spread quickly across Turkish media. They held a press conference for him, and Billy kept repeating the same message. He apologized for the mistakes in the film and the negative image it gave of Turkey. He said he loved the country and its people, and after that visit, everything became peaceful again. Everyone reconciled, and the whole film incident became a thing of the past. No one held any bad feelings anymore. As of now, Billy is still alive and 77 years old. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.